Hello and welcome back to the Elden Ring tales. Last time Ren Rama-sama hunted down the dragon of this lake and now he's going to brag about it. There was this one NPC, Yura is his name, who kept saying how stupid it is to challenge this dragon. It kinda sounded like a quest, so I'm interested to see how it progresses from here. But unfortunately...
Beautiful work, felling that dragon, and as such, there's something you might like to know. The heart you brought back. It's used in dragon communion. If you should find yourself overcome by hunger for the heart, yearning for its strength, then seek the decrepit church on the little island off the western coast.
Yeah, I know this place. I was there in the last chapter. Honestly, it doesn't sound interesting from Ren Rama-sama's perspective. He would gladly forge a new armor out of its skin. But eating the heart of a dragon to gain its strength? Maybe in more dire times, but right now... No, Ren Rama-sama is really disappointed. He is used to getting rewards after hunting monsters, and if not, then at least give him a new quest with a new monster to hunt. But Yura didn't give him anything. Right now he's not sure what to do in these lands. This typical feeling of an open world game that you can go everywhere you want is new for this character, and I used that as an excuse to explore a little. Because last time I had a lot of positive experiences here in Limgrave. So let's see what else this place has to offer. That's what you will be seeing today, and that also leads me to today's topic. The open world game design. I've danced around this issue in the previous chapters. I mentioned it a couple of times, but now I cannot longer avoid it. And I wanted to avoid it because, you see, I have a confession to make. If you listen carefully, this will not come as a surprise, but the truth is, I don't like open world games. Don't get me wrong, there are good open world titles, but if you ask me, those are the exception in a genre which is mostly populated by repetitive and boring games. I will explain what I mean by that in this video, and... did I just summon the wrath of this game? That's certainly not a player character, so it must be a guardian of Elden Ring trying to shut me up. But you cannot stop me. Nobody can stop Ren Rama-sama. Oh. Well, I'm off to a really good start. Here we are in round 2. This is the first invader that I face in Elden Ring. Up until this point I wasn't even sure if there were any in this game. But it seems to be business as usual. They even have this red shadow look from Dark Souls. However, there is something special to this fight.
It is Narius. The end is nigh. For you. And your cessblood.
That was Yura, wasn't it? What does he want now? No, seriously, what was that little monologue? Nothing is happening. Out of Estes? I know that feeling. Okay, that's it. Aha, he's over there. And he's already gone. Was he stuck on the terrain? Yeah, it seems like it. This rock must have blocked him. How stupid is that? So the game just didn't want to support me in this fight. It really doesn't want me to talk about open worlds. Before we come to that, there is one more thing I want to cover. After this fight I sat down at the site of grace nearby, leveled up a bit and changed some equipment. So far the claimer proved to be very effective, so I thought to myself, why not go a step further? That's why I'm dual wielding greatswords now. From this point onward, Ren Rama-sama is all about offense. Big meaty attacks, high damage, and no shield or even the ability to block. Because you cannot do that while dual wielding. My only defensive option is to evade, so it is a trade-off, but I want to try out this playstyle. The second greatsword is the Lord Swan's greatsword. I strengthened it to +1 and the claimer to +2, because it's awesome. To round out the look I put on the Kaiden armor, which in terms of stats is similar to the scale armor from before, but it looks more fitting to this brutish playstyle. Here's the status screen. I'm level 20 now and put some points into vigor and endurance. I will probably continue investing in those stats for now because I want to be able to carry heavy stuff. Now you know what I'm working with in this chapter, so let's dive into today's topic. This story about open world games starts like most tragedies, with the curse that was sealed into Pandora's box. Hope. That is what this cave right here represents to me. It starts out nice and simple, and by just looking at it from the outside you wouldn't know about the valuable treasure I found here. First up is this encounter with these thieves. I chose a stealthy approach here, and in retrospect I got really lucky because without even realizing it I evaded the trap of this place. I just jumped over it. It's almost impossible to see here, but when I came back to this cave much later, this happened. There is a chain with some little chimes attached to it on the ground. Stepping on it alarms all the nearby thieves, creating this full-fledged ambush. I didn't know it was there on my first visit. It was pure luck I avoided it. A nice little mechanic, this trap, and I'm sure it will appear again. This ambush is rather harmless, but there might be more dangerous ones in the future. Here you can see the trap itself. But all of this was just the appetizer. Not that far away I stumbled over this boss door. Since the thieves weren't a big challenge, I confidently walked through it and then... nothing. Okay, what do we have here? A big open room. Looks like somebody lives here. The fire is still lit, so she or he must be close by. And there is this chest. I know this is a From Software game, so I have a suspicion what this means. I'm probably locked into this room with a mimic. How do I deal with this? I could attack it, but I don't know what this does to chests in this game. Ever since Dark Souls 2 I'm cautious with that, I don't want to risk it. So what to do? I guess I will just take it. Even if it kills me right away, at least then I will have made the experience. Then I know that there are mimics in this game, which is nice to know. So let's just get it over with. Nothing.
Well. Thought you'd just help yourself to a man's personal belongings, huh?
Patches?
You scheming little thief.
Oh my god.
Gods demand repentance. Cough up your coin. All of it.
Patches is in this game? I thought after Dark Souls 3 and the Ringed City his character arc was finished. And now I'm fighting him? This is hype in a weird way. Okay, I can absolutely not lose to him. That would be the biggest embarrassment ever.
Wait, please. I surrender. White flag and all.
That's just cute. That's exactly how this fight has to end.
Well, finally come round, have you? I knew you would. You're a man of reason. Through and through.
That was simply the best. What a great moment. It was surprising, well orchestrated, and funny as well.
Well, what do you know? You're tarnished like me. Now, how did I get that wrong? I took you for a demi-human or some such. An innocent mistake, I assure you. Well, water under the bridge. Now we're squared up. How about we play nice from now on?
Oh, Patches, you never change.
A true man of reason. Just what I like about you. I'm Patches. Patches the Untethered.
I wasn't expecting him at all. What a nice surprise. After this incident he becomes a merchant, and when returning later on he starts with his typical Patches shenanigans.
Wondering what's inside the treasure chest. Well, it's nothing too special. Just something I'm saving as thanks for a very valuable customer. But then again, it would fetch some spectacular coin. And besides, this valuable customer could be a long time coming. Huh? Everything is give and take. Give and take.
Here's the deal with patches. He will pull tricks on you and will probably cause a couple of player deaths, but usually you also gain something out of it, like getting thrown into secret areas or acquiring certain items. The question you as a player have to answer is if you want to put up with his nonsense or rather choose to ignore him. At this point I didn't make my decision, so I left the ominous chest untouched and moved on. All things considered, the trip to this cave was absolutely worth it. I would be disappointed if I never came here and found out about patches only after finishing the game. But now I know that these mini-dungeons can contain NPCs and interesting events. And that creates a dilemma for me. Because Patches was in this unassuming little cave. From the outside there was nothing remarkable about it. But inside was a character that will beyond any doubt lead me into funny and also infuriating situations. That's the biggest treasure you can find in such a dungeon. I did not expect that such an important NPC was just sitting around in such a random cave. So what does this mean? That every cave, or at least a big portion of them, has valuable encounters like this? That I have to go into all of them? Remember when I was talking about hope and Pandora's box? This thought right here was the opening of the box, and now I was full of hope. If I can find such a treasure at such an unremarkable location, then Elden Ring must be full of encounters like this. Then it must be worth to explore every corner of the map and every little dungeon. That's what I continue to do in this chapter, and you will see where that led me. And while this is going on, let's dig a bit deeper into open world games and why I usually don't like them. Let me start out by saying that there is nothing wrong with disliking a certain type of game or even whole genres. I like fighting games, a lot of people don't, and on the other hand I find no fun in racing games, while many people enjoy them. That's called personal taste, and there's no real debate about it. You don't have to explain why you don't like a specific genre, everybody should rather stick to what they like. But this gets troublesome if some genres or elements of them get so mainstream that suddenly almost every game has to have them. Skill trees from RPGs, quicktime events, hacking minigames, or the microtransaction shop from Fortnite. I could name more examples, but that would be missing the point here, because you're looking at one example right now. A big open world map seems to be one of these features that you can slap on the back of your box or put it into your trailers and everybody is pleased. The critics, the market analysts and the gaming community. And now we even have a From Software game that has a big open world map. I'm not a fan, not at all, and since I seem to be in the minority, I will explain why. In the end, all of this will come back to my personal taste, but on my way to that conclusion, I want to present some reasons, some hooks to think about. If you love open world games, then they might help you understand why you like them so much, and why not everybody does. And if you despise them like me, then this might help you explain why that is. What I experienced with Patches earlier was a worthwhile experience, and open world games have a lot of them. But they also have big, sometimes gigantic maps, and the bigger your map is, the more worthwhile experiences you need to prevent it from feeling empty, or even boring. There is a popular game design theory that can be applied here. You may have heard it before. It was created by Soren Johnson, who was heavily inspired by Sid Meier. They worked together at Firaxis Games on titles like Civilization 3 and 4, and the formula that Soren created fits those games perfectly. He states that total fun equals meaningful decisions divided by time played. This means that a game is more fun if it has more meaningful decisions, and it is even more fun if it has the same amount of decisions in less playtime. That's the short version of it, and if you look at Civilization games, it becomes clear where he is coming from. These games are turn-based, and in each turn you make a couple of decisions. It depends on the state of your game, but some examples are: where should your units move? What technology do you want to research next? And what do you want to build in one of your cities? What makes these decisions meaningful is the impact they have on the game. You have different options that lead to different results. Sometimes they are immediately visible, others might have long-term consequences. There's much more to it, and in case you want to dive into the theory, I put some links into the description for you. Before I move on, I want to clarify that this is not the golden formula of game design, the holy grail that solves everything around fun in games. In my opinion, it is a great tool to evaluate the gameplay of a title and how engaging it is. But it neglects a lot of aspects that are also meaningful to games, and those can create fun as well, like the aesthetics, the atmosphere, the story or the content of a game, satisfying controls or the immersion. There's a lot more to it than just decisions, so I cannot agree that meaningful decisions divided by time played equals total fun. I would rather adjust it to fun through gameplay. With that, we can still say that story-driven games or clever puzzle games, just to name 2 examples, that those can also be fun, even if they don't have a lot of meaningful decisions. That would just mean that the pure gameplay is probably not very engaging. And it also means that right here in my discussion I focus on the gameplay experience and not much else. I will now apply this concept to other genres, and while I'm doing that, please keep in mind that there might be other aspects to a game that are more important for your meaning of fun. I already talked about Civilization, which is a rather slow game, so let's look for examples that run on the opposite of that spectrum. How about character action games like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, because I like talking about them. In these games, most of your time is spent fighting groups of enemies, and while doing that, the player is constantly making decisions, probably multiple per second. Which enemy do you attack next? How do you close the distance? Which attack string do you want to initiate? When do you react on other enemies that are approaching you? When do you dodge? When do you want to use your Devil Trigger or Umbran Climax? All of these decisions may seem trivial, but they constantly change the state of the game. If you take out an enemy, the dynamic of the whole encounter changes, because now there is one less threat to worry about. And if you miscalculate and get hit, then you have less health for the rest of the level, or your character might even die, which is the most impactful of all consequences. What I just did with character action games can easily be transferred to other genres as well. Strategy games, shooters, racing or sport games. In all of them you make decisions on a regular basis, and if they are well designed, then these decisions are meaningful as well. Even in games with simple control schemes like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario World, you can find meaningful decisions everywhere, because they throw you into levels with their own obstacles and gimmicks. And in games with a slower pace, you might get into these magical situations where you can see the outcome of your decision coming before it actually happens on screen. Right here I wanted to talk about Castlevania 1 and how you can't change the direction of your jump in mid-air, but we have a nice example of this on screen right now. The combat in Elden Ring and other From Software titles is mainly driven by making decisions. None of your actions are hard to execute, you usually press a button and just have to consider the timing of your action. But once the button is pressed, you have to wait until the end of your character's animation before you can do something else. And a lot can happen during that time. This combat system emphasizes the player's decisions and the consequences. It makes you think about when to attack and which defensive option to use. When making a wrong decision, no hasty button presses or other tricks will save you. You have to live with the consequences, and that's one of the many reasons why combat in Souls games feels so great. Elden Ring is no ordinary From Software game though. It's an open world game, and in those most of your time is usually not spent in combat, but rather with exploring the world. Which means that you move your character somewhere on the big map and are either traversing into a general direction where you want to explore, or you have a specific goal like a quest marker or some other noteworthy point on your map. There are decisions to be made here, like setting a goal, how to overcome obstacles on the way, and when to let yourself get distracted by other things that you find. They may be meaningful decisions, but there is a lot of time in between them. You decide where to go and then you go for a while, until you stumble upon something that needs a new decision. That can take a minute or even more, and that results in a lot of downtime. And the bigger your map, the bigger is the distance between events and encounters. When looking at the formula of Søren Johnson, then open world games have a distinct disadvantage of having a pretty high playtime, which is only natural if you have a really big map. And making the maps even bigger seems to be a trend these days, one that I cannot understand. A big map by itself is worth nothing. What I want as a player are the events that are on this map, but the bigger the open world, the less likely it is that there are enough events to make this experience worthwhile. That's why I shudder when a AAA studio announces that their next open world game will have the biggest map ever. For me, that sounds like a reason to avoid this game. But coming back to the time, there are of course other games with long playtimes that don't feature an enormous world, and some of them are great. So just looking at the time played and at the size of the map is not enough. It puts these games on a disadvantage, but with enough meaningful decisions they can get good results in this formula. And that leads us to the main problem that open world games have. Most of them don't have enough interesting things in them. I mean, look at the footage I've been feeding you since the cave with patches. There were some fights with slime enemies and skeletons, both of which I have fought a couple of times until now. And then there is this dungeon here, which seems to be a replica of the one that we saw in chapter 2. None of this was really entertaining, wasn't it? Normally I would cut that stuff out and only show the interesting bits, but right now it's supporting my point. All of this was basically downtime. It was just traversing with not many meaningful decisions. Even the combat parts were enemies that I already know too well. It was all repetition. And repetition kills meaningful decisions. Each time you repeat it, it slowly loses its meaningfulness. This dungeon here is a good example. It has the same visual design and the same enemies as the catacombs from chapter 2. It even repeats the core gimmick with the lever that you have to pull in order to open the boss door. The only difference I can see is that it doesn't have these flamethrower pillars and instead introduces traps with pressure plates. But that's it. If I never visited the other catacombs I wouldn't mind, but encountering such a poor repetition this early in the game worries me. Because repetition is what ruins open world games for me. They just have too much of it. There is a reason why in platformer games you usually encounter a specific gimmick just in one level and after that it's ditched for another. Because too much repetition hurts the pacing of these games, and that's true for a lot of genres. In open world games, however, repeating specific events is an easy way to fill out your big map. Create one interesting side quest, copy it a couple of times with slight alterations, and then paste it all over the map. That's basically what this dungeon here is. At least the boss is not a repeat. Although I can imagine this guy appearing again, his design looks like a regular enemy of a late game area. But for now I'm able to enjoy this fight, mostly because it feels like a mirror match. We are both dual-wielding heavy weapons that deal a lot of damage and can stagger easily. His weapon is much cooler though. The chain between his hammers opens up a lot of possibilities for cool maneuvers, and this enemy demonstrates it. I wonder if this is a weapon the player character can wield as well. I had my fun with this one, but all in all it's nothing too special. His moveset is rather simple for the most part, and there are no surprises to spice things up or some kind of escalation. It redeemed this dungeon partly, but it will probably not be a boss I will remember at the end of the game. It was fun while it lasted, but there's no point in talking about it any longer. Unless it will be repeated later on, of course. But I have to say, outside of this dungeon there wasn't that much repetition in Elden Ring so far. The encounters on the world map offer some variation and I'm still finding new stuff. It is way too early to pass judgment on this game. Maybe it is similar to other open world games and I will dislike it in the end, but maybe its focus on combat is much bigger than I anticipated and there will be fun and challenging encounters all throughout the game. I will review Elden Ring at some point, but for now, that is a story for another day. Until now, my experience here reminds me a lot of my time with Breath of the Wild, which is good in one way, because in my opinion The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the best open world game I played. But on the other hand, it's bad news, because even Breath of the Wild has a lot of problems I talked about so far. So while Ren Rama-sama explores another uneventful dungeon, I will make a quick deep dive into Breath of the Wild and its open world, and I will explain why I'm not a fan of one of the most beloved games of the last decade. The next section will be all about Breath of the Wild, so here's a quick disclaimer. If you haven't played it and don't want to get spoiled, just skip until the timestamp that's on screen right now. You will still be able to follow my reasoning if you don't watch the Breath of the Wild section. It is just an example of the topics I discussed so far. Okay, Breath of the Wild. You should know that I'm a huge Zelda fan and my favorite one is A Link to the Past. I could easily make a case here why for me Breath of the Wild is one of the weaker Zelda titles, but that's not the story here. this is only about the open world that Breath of the Wild presents, and the first thing to point out here is how huge it is. The map of Hyrule in this game is gigantic and is mostly filled with big open plains, and you can spend hours just running around in them. Coming back to the formula around fun in gameplay, there is probably no debate that Breath of the Wild comes with an enormous time played, meaning it needs a whole bunch of meaningful decisions to make up for that. So what has this big map of Hyrule to offer? There are of course some really good things here. I liked all the quests surrounding the Divine Beasts, especially the one in the Gerudo Desert. I also enjoyed the Lost Woods, and Hyrule Castle is by far the best area in the whole game. I could name some more examples, but that would lead us nowhere because all of these unique events cover just a small amount of playtime. When looking at my own playthrough, which took 66 hours by the way, which is probably on the lower end, then most of my time was spent traversing the world and finding Koroks and shrines. Those are the most prominent features of Breath of the Wild because there's a ton of them. 900 Koroks and 120 shrines to be precise. Unless you ignore them for whatever reason, they are the most frequent things you encounter. Meaning, when looking at the gameplay and how fun it is, Koroks and shrines are the most important. They have to provide the majority of the meaningful decisions. Unfortunately, the Koroks and their seeds are kinda... Let's be real here, even if you are a Breath of the Wild fan, you were probably bored by them at some point. I know nobody who enjoyed collecting them. At first it's interesting to find Koroks and the little variations they offer. Some have a block puzzle attached to them, some little archery or speedrun challenges, and some are just hidden under a rock. But sooner or later the constant copy and pasting of these patterns will bore you out. Everything that could be meaningful about them is sucked out by the constant repetition, and all joy and sense of wonder is lost. For me it was around the 100 mark that I started to actively ignoring them. I just avoided the areas that clearly housed a Korok, because there was just no fun, no point in collecting them. Collecting all 900 sounds like a punishment for me. In summary, the Koroks don't add many meaningful decisions. So now it's the shrines who have to save the day. Luckily they are much better, with many of them feeling like a room out of a good Zelda dungeon. There was some repetition in mechanics, but most of them offered something new. Except for the 20 tests of strength, which were basically 3 different mini-boss fights repeated over and over again. It was always a bummer when I entered a shrine just to find another one of those. And they put 20 of those in the game, what were they thinking? But the remaining ones, or at least the one I found, were fine. Although it bugged me that they all used the same visuals and the same song. A little bit of variation in the look and feel would have come a long way. But back to the gameplay. The shrines were enjoyable and added something to the game. And apart from them? Well, a lot of time is spent in side quests that ask you to find 5 of this item and sometimes 4 of another, and they are pasted all over the map and just the item and amount in question are changed. Regarding combats, most of the game you fight 1 of 3 enemy types, and clearing out moblem camps felt out quickly, unfortunately. There is just not enough enemy variety to make the combat interesting. And then there are the main dungeons that felt like 4 sections out of 1 of the same dungeon. And in between all these things you roam around the open field or climb mountains for minutes and nothing really happens. Lots of downtime. All in all, I have to say, Breath of the Wild just doesn't offer much engaging gameplay for its long playtime. That's why after roughly 64 hours I just aborted what I was doing, went straight to Hyrule Castle and fought the final boss. That was the best thing I could have done, because that last section was lots of fun and allowed me to send this game off with a bang, instead of dragging out the endless exploration until I lost the last bit of my interest. So that was my experience with Breath of the Wild. Lots of downtime, not many meaningful decisions, and they are divided by a huge playtime, which leaves just a small amount of fun through gameplay. And remember, Breath of the Wild is my favorite of this genre. If I had done the same analysis with a Bethesda or Ubisoft open world game that uses even more copy-pasting of the same events, then I would have been much harsher. At this point I welcome back everybody who skipped the last section, although let's be real here, you probably didn't. But for the rare chance that somebody did, the big conclusion of the last paragraph was that open world games in general don't offer much fun through gameplay because they mostly consist of downtime and the meaningful decisions they have get copy-pasted a lot. But you know what? That is fine. There is actually nothing wrong with that. Because not every game has to have engaging gameplay all the time. As I said before, there are other values that can create fun. And for open world games, the feeling of exploration is one such value. Traveling to different parts of the map and finding stuff there can create a feeling of accomplishment. That's the basic goal that open world games are based on, clearing out the map and finding stuff. And all of this is usually very relaxing. For most of their playtime, open world games are usually very chill experiences. And after a long, hard day, that might be exactly what you as a player need. In an action or strategy game, you have to be concentrated and often have to perform a lot of moves in a short amount of time. You kinda have to put work into these games. Meanwhile, in an open world game, you just press forward and move for a while, until you find something interesting that you can interact with. Or don't if you are not in the mood. That's way more relaxing, and finding stuff on the big map can produce dopamine just like defeating an enemy in an action game can. So in other words, having engaging gameplay is not the point of open world games. It's rather exploration, being able to relax a bit and encountering different things from time to time. When I was criticizing the downtime and the low amount of interesting decisions, I was not only describing the weaknesses, but also the strengths. Because other players would rather be talking about enjoyable, stress-free gameplay that allows them to engage with the big world in their own pace. Put simply, I'm just not the target audience for open world games. I want to have engaging gameplay, I want to be constantly challenged and be forced to focus on the game I play. At least most of the time, even I can appreciate a more relaxing experience from time to time. And for you it might be the other way around. Maybe you want to be challenged from time to time, but most of your playtime should allow you to relax and just enjoy the atmosphere. Then good open world games might just be your thing. And then you can just dismiss this formula here, because for you, fun through gameplay is not that important. It's all up to your personal taste. And this is where I could lay this topic about open world games to rest. But I won't, there's much more to say about it, for example why I'm still playing this game, even though I usually don't like this genre. However, I haven't talked about Elden Ring for a while, so let's focus on what's happening on the screen for a change. The Limgrave tunnels here are now catacombs, so we get a different look, different enemies and a different structure, which is all fine and well, but after my experience in the catacombs I expect this design to get repeated as well. At this point I have lost my faith in these mini dungeons, and even if it should be completely unique, then there is not that much it brings to the table. I like the vertical sections with the elevators, because there's usually something hidden if you find a safe way to jump down by yourself. That mixes up the gameplay a little, and thanks to the well implemented jump controls, the platforming here feels solid. However, even in this small dungeon this trick is repeated, so it gets old quickly. Another nice touch are these enemies that are working here. Some of them are completely focused on their mining activities, and as long as nobody bothers them, they will not care about the player. Funnily, one way to aggro them is by picking up the materials they are mining. That's totally relatable, they are working here for probably an eternity and then some rude character just comes along and grabs their goods. They should have received a buff in case you aggro them in this way. These enemies here are new for Ren Rama-sama, and their high defense and the fact that weak attacks get repelled by their hard skin makes them quite unique. There are some variations of those guys, some can throw fire bombs and others have a flamethrower. Combined with the dog and rat enemies, that's much more enemy variety than in the catacombs. But in my opinion it's still not enough, the fights in here feel way too repetitive. Maybe I'm too strict with these mini dungeons, but at this point I'm pretty disappointed. Why are there so many of them in such close vicinity, and why don't they add something to the game? They start to feel like a chore, and after this I will probably avoid them for a while. However, we haven't reached the lowest point yet, because there was one horrible surprise left. What is this? Seriously, that's not a boss, that's a normal enemy from the overworld. Well, not exactly the same, because he has some kind of hammer instead of a sword. And he starts with it in his hands. The normal enemies start out with their fists, and at roughly 50% of their health they grab their weapon. Which is a decent second phase that increases the tension. I guess having him use his weapon for the whole encounter makes it harder. And he probably has more health and deals more damage. But nothing of that really matters. This is just not a boss fight. A boss should be a unique, well-crafted challenge that, in the best case, built on what was introduced in the area before it. So if he were a giant version of those stone guys, it would have been better, but this guy? He doesn't belong here. How did he even get here? He doesn't fit into the small entrance of the cave. And logic aside, the fight is more or less like the one giant I fought on the Weeping Peninsula. From what I can tell, they share the same moveset, so even if he were a super hard version with maximum stats, that wouldn't make it special. He is just a recycled normal enemy that has to fill out the role of the boss of this dungeon, because From Software was apparently not able to design enough bosses for their game. Now that I think about it, this whole dungeon, including the boss, is like a condensed example of what I don't like about open world games. When I was talking about downtime, repetition and unengaging gameplay, this is what I meant. Apart from the combat, there's nothing meaningful here, it's just wasted playtime that I would rather have spent on something well designed instead of a dungeon that's probably copied a dozen of times all over Elden Ring. This is what the exploration of this play session has led me to. Remember Pandora's box and hope? Now it's turned into desperation and boredom. And that's why I will stop doing this. For today there is no more exploration, instead I want to focus on the parts of the game that offer something more. And that will lead Ren Rama-sama back to the start of this episode. Because the next thing I'll do is pay Patches another visit. Before that I have to finish this fight. Feel free to skip to the next timestamp if you want. However, the ending of this fight is rather suspenseful because I ran out of healing flasks and had to manage the last 20% of his health with almost no life. His freakishly big hitboxes are so hard to avoid. It is a difficult fight, I can give it that. Okay, that has been dealt with, so let's move on. Next up, Patch's Cave. I decided on how to deal with him in this playthrough. I will put up with whatever he will do to me. I know that he will trick me, but I will accept any shenanigans and every resulting death. I just want to see what he has in store for me, and usually his tricks are pretty entertaining. That's why I will finally open this ominous chest. It's not a mimic, but that's new. What is happening?
Well, well, well. I should have known, you scheming little thief. The gods demand vengeance! Vengeance!
I'm here now. Somehow. And there's a monster to hunt. So, let's do it. This is officially the hardest fight of this play session now, and it isn't even a boss. This mega bear has two tricks that make him immensely hard. For one, he is almost impossible to stagger. I'm smashing two greatswords into him and throw firebombs at his face, but he doesn't even flinch. He just keeps attacking. And his second trick are his gigantic hitboxes. A lot of his attacks involve him leaping towards you or smashing his arms to the ground, and his whole body becomes his weapon doing that. Very hard to evade. And then there's also his command grab. A really tough package. But at last, the monster has been hunted. Let's recollect what happened. I opened the chest in Patch's cave and a white gas came out that made me unconscious. Then I woke up here. I assume Patches brought me here to sacrifice me to the elder bear gods, or to teach me a lesson. Let's see what he has to say about that.
Ryan, you're alive. Oh, you had me proper scared, puffing away in a flash like that. Well, maybe it's a sign to keep your mitts off what's not rightly yours, hmm? But I'll forgive you. View it as a learning experience. At any rate, it's just nice to see you safe. Oh, don't miss all the bargains here at Patch's Emporium.
I see. He has given Ren Rama-sama now more than enough reasons to never trust him again. But I want to see how this continues, so I will happily walk into his next trap as well. But not today. It seems Patches is finished for now, which means that I will now follow the main path of the game and head for Stormvale Castle, hoping that this place will be much better than the mini-dungeons of this chapter. Although, before Ren Rama-sama moves north, there is one more encounter I want to try out. When I was here in chapter 2 and tested out the bird's eye telescope, I noticed a black rider on the bridge nearby. I fought one of these Nazgûls before, but back then I didn't have Torrent's help. The fight was a slog, and now I want to see how it plays out when I'm also on horseback. As you can see, it's a completely different affair. In my duel with the first Nazgûl and also against the Erdtree Sentinel, I had to stand around and wait for the enemy to offer an opening, which was extremely slow paced. This right here is like playing a different game. Thanks to our high movement speed, we are circling and drifting around each other. I no longer have to wait for an opening, but can rather try to outmaneuver the Nazgûl. He has a long halberd, so I need to get out of the way of his attacks, which looks a bit wonky. The sharp turns and the double jumps are not very realistic, but who cares if the gameplay is fun? And it certainly is. While I feel overpowered when riding on Torrent and fighting enemies on foot, this duel against another rider feels fair. It is mostly decided by the skills of the riders to control their steed and to get in some hits without taking damage. I like it, please give me more of that. And with that, the second Nazgûl is down, so there must be 7 left. Now it's time to follow the path to the castle, and look what we got here. That's a familiar sight. Will you also have boss music? I'm still annoyed by the disappointing fight from the Limgrave tunnels. This is From Software we are talking about here. They are the masters of tense and well-staged boss fights. You can usually count on them delivering something memorable. But to be honest, so far there was no real great boss fight in this game. The Leonine Misbegotten is the king in that regard, but if he were in Bloodborne or Dark Souls, he would be on the lower end of the ranking. Is this also due to Elden Ring being open world? I don't know, but so far my prejudices against this genre seem to come true. As I pointed out earlier, this is just my problem, because I don't belong to the typical target audience of open world games. Which begs the question why I continue playing Elden Ring. Well, for one, the combat is great. Since there is so much repetition in enemies, it can't shine like in a SoulsBorne, but you shouldn't forget that this is still the starting area of the game. I expect the later areas to be much more difficult, with many different and creative enemies. If that's true, then Elden Ring will be able to partially bypass the weakness that I see in open world games of having a lot of downtime. It might even create a similar feeling like a Grand Theft Auto game. Because GTA is the big example to contradict all of my theories about why I don't like open world games. In GTA, exploring the world is far from being boring because here you don't just move on your big map and get to your quest markers, you are constantly interacting with all the systems of the game, like the traffic, the police, and NPCs on the street. When traversing in GTA, every second you are confronted with one meaningful decision that accompanies you through most of the game. Do you want to commit a crime? To break the rules in some way and start a chain reaction of chaotic events that are almost impossible to predict? Or do you rather want to focus on not pulling attention and stay inside the boundaries of the law? With just this one decision you can instantly change your mode of play from chill exploration to full-on action and racing. It's like being able to choose between two games on the fly. That's why I would classify GTA and its clones as outliers in the open world genre. The game doesn't just focus on exploration and tackling missions or other goals in your own pace, it is also about chaotic and destructive action, and if you are not in the mood for one of these game modes, you can quickly change to the other. And Elden Ring could potentially achieve something similar. Actually, as long as I'm not in one of those boring mini-dungeons, I feel like I have the possibility of changing the game mode as soon as I see a group of enemies. Granted, this decision is not constantly available, but the density of enemy encounters is rather high. And density is another one of those magical words that can help an open world game bypassing the formula of fun through gameplay. If a game is not about having a super big map, but rather about having a map where you can find interesting and unique things everywhere, then it can also lead to a lot of meaningful decisions in a short amount of time. The most extreme example of that would be a Yakuza game. Those aren't open world games, but their areas are a great example for density. When walking through the small map of a Yakuza game, you will be confronted with an extreme amount of options. There are characters, minigames, side stories and other things to interact with everywhere. There's almost no position on the map where you can't access at least two completely different events in a couple of seconds. Getting distracted from the main story is way easier here than in a gigantic open world. So these are the two pillars of hope that I have for Elden Ring. Being able to switch into engaging combat to spicing up the exploration, and having a solid density of interesting events. We'll see if the game will deliver on those, or if it will be a game that pleases just the fans of typical open world games. Which would be fine as well, because that is a big and profitable audience. If all of them can enjoy the game, then there is no harm if someone like me doesn't like it. However, that would have consequences for this playthrough, and I don't want to think about them now. I would rather end this open world discussion on a positive note, and gladly there is one aspect of this genre that even I enjoy a lot. It is a byproduct of the freedom that the big open maps offer. If there are interesting events and mechanics in these games, then they are able to create something truly magical. Player-driven stories. Sometimes by interacting with the world and the systems of a game, you as a player start to connect the seemingly random events into a cohesive story. A story that accompanies you throughout the game and that is not told by the game and its characters, but rather by the way you play. This can be extremely engaging, and as long as the story continues, it can just blow everything I discussed today away. Fun through gameplay, density and all that stuff doesn't matter when you have this feeling of creating a unique experience by just playing the game. In a way, these player-driven stories are the antithesis of my theory about fun through gameplay. But in the end, every good theory needs its exceptions to be complete. If you couldn't follow the confusing stuff that I was just talking about, then no worries, because player-driven stories will be the topic of the next chapter. So stay tuned for the Elden Ring Tales Chapter 4, The Quest for the Holy Grail. But first I have to wrap up this chapter. You just saw me using the spirit wolves. I tested them out here because there were so many enemies around. It was quite a battle and the wolves helped out a lot. But I'm still not sure about this feature. I think I would have enjoyed this encounter more if I fought them all by myself. I don't think I will use the spirit summoning much in this game, but it needs more testing. Although, certainly not during the last event of today's chapter. When the game offers me a worthy challenge, then I want to engage with it in the purest way possible. There is nothing wrong with summoning spirits during boss fights, but that's just not how I want to play the game. If there is a formidable foe, then I want to fight it alone. I usually also don't summon other players during my playthroughs of SoulsBorne games. I want to be in the position of the underdog, because that's just how I can enjoy these fights the most. That's why the spirit summons don't fit into my playstyle. So here we are in front of the next boss. I was criticizing the design of the dungeon bosses earlier, and this fight right here shows me that I was absolutely right. Because everything Ren Rama-sama fought so far pales in comparison to this one. Just look at how the boss is introduced.
Foul tarnished. In search of the Elden Ring. Emboldened by the flame of ambition.
Look at him. What's going on with his head? It's also noteworthy that he just teleported in. And now? What an entrance. And now look how the camera is angled to make him appear even more imposing.
Someone must extinguish thy flame. Let it be Margit the Fell.
Margit the Fell Omen. Even without trading the first blows, you immediately know that this is the real deal. And it's not just the cutscene or the amazing music, the boss arena itself tells a story as well. He is literally blocking the path. Until now, the only direction the player got was to go to Stormvale Castle, and Margit presents himself as the roadblock you have to overcome. There is no way around it. On the left and the right side of the arena there's just an abyss. The only way is forward, and the golden door behind Margit marks your goal. Behind that you can catch a glimpse of the majestic castle with its towers and the banners that wave in the wind. And on top of that, Margit gives us some lore snippets in his short dialogue. It's not much, but we now know that his purpose is to vanquish Tarnished and to make sure that he defeats them as often as it is needed to make them give up. And then there is his design. Well, it's hard to tell what he actually is. Just by his looks, he might be related to the misbegotten of Castle Rama-sama, formerly known as Castle Morn. But I doubt that, because they were rebelling against the forces of Godric, while Margit here is guarding the door to Godric's castle. Also, Margit can speak, which clearly shows that he's something else. Next to his strangely formed head, his tail is probably the most disturbing feature. Reminds me of a scorpion tail, and he can actually dish out some damage with it. His weapon is also strange. It looks like an old tree trunk. Certainly not a weapon of high quality, and the same is true for his robes. His equipment looks so cheap, so he's definitely not a knight of Godric, but rather some outcast who is desperately clinging to every piece of equipment he can find. And that was obviously not a lot. So there's a lot of mystery revolving around this boss, and I'm looking forward to the conclusion, if there is any.
These foolish ambitions to rest.
Put these foolish ambitions to rest? That could be directed at the player himself, which creates this meta relationship between him and the player. Can you bring up the motivation to fight against him over and over again? Or do you give up and rage quit out of the game? That's clever. And even if we ignore all the storytelling around this boss, the fight itself from a mechanical perspective is much better than all of the other bosses before him. He has this well-telegraphed moveset, and apart from his tail swipe you can see all of his attacks clearly coming, but he delays them in an absurd degree. His wind-up animations are cleverly timed to provoke a panic dodge roll, so you are wide open when the attack actually starts. He kinda fakes you out, and to mix things up he has his daggers. They are interesting as well. I assume they deal holy damage, and the same is probably true for the other weapons of light that he summons. So he is a miracle caster with a focus on melee spells, which means he belongs to a faction that is somehow related to the holy elements of this game. The biggest of these miracles is his giant hammer jump that he uses as a transition to phase 2. This is a tense and almost cinematic moment that clearly communicates that he is now using everything he's got. So you know you have to do the same. And in his second phase he uses even more of his miracles. There's just so much to praise here. It's not like he's the best From Software boss ever, far from it actually. But he is without any doubt the best boss I faced in Elden Ring so far, and nothing comes even close. The storytelling, the moveset, the tension, it's all here, and now I'm questioning the half-hearted bosses from before even more. If something of this quality is in the game, then why even deal with the other fake bosses? This one is clearly well designed. They put a lot of thought into it, instead of taking a normal enemy and bump up the stats. This right here is the most fun I had with Elden Ring so far, so let's just enjoy it for a while. There was some sadness when I pressed the button to throw the final fire pot. I felt the great enemy, but now this great fight is over.
Tarnished, smouldering with thy meager flame, cower in fear of the night. The hands of the fell omen shall brook thee no quarter.
And he just keeps on giving, even after the fight. That was great. And with that, this long chapter comes to an end. Although Melina has another teaser for the next one.
Forgive me. I've been testing you to see whether or not grace truly does guide you, and whether you are fit to face the challenge that entails. It seems my worries were unfounded. Torrent had your measure from the very start, whereas I merely pretended. There is but one other thing I can do to offer you guidance. I can take you to the Round Table Hall, gathering place of tarnished champions, guided by grace.
Interesting that you don't even have the choice to decline.
Very well. Let my hand rest upon you for but a moment.
So off to the Round Table Hold in the next chapter. Until then, farewell.